Despite all the noise, there was an oppressive silence. It was always like this in places like this. Criminologists, uniformed policemen, and plainclothes detectives were busy everywhere. There were several quiet conversations. Potential evidence was marked and packed. Cameras clicked. Police radios made short noises. Mobile phones rang. An ambulance was waiting, and curious neighbors were fussing outside. But despite all the noise, it seemed that the air was too dense for the sound to spread properly, like a muted guitar string in a soundproof room. Detectives Michael Reyes and Gil Mumford were seasoned veterans of the Dallas Police Department, DPD. Reyes and Mumford had been working in homicide for 10 and 8 years, respectively, and were the lead detectives assigned to the case. They received a call around 10:30 a.m. and went to an address in Oak Cliff, a well-maintained area of South Dallas. They calmly examined the crime scene for a few moments and then quickly got to work. Reyes walked over to the body on the floor and began a conversation with the coroner, while Mumford began interviewing people in uniform. Although the area, Oak Cliff, was quickly becoming popular with young professionals due to renovation, there were still quite a few problems here, and shooting was not uncommon. Infrequent, but frightening for new residents seeking to occupy this part of the city. After a single shot sounded in the morning, a worried young assistant prosecutor dialed 911. The body was found reclined on the back of a chair, one gunshot wound to the head, a small entrance hole on the right temple, and a large exit wound just below the left ear. A 9mm semi-automatic pistol was lying on the floor next to the body. There were no signs of forced entry or a suicide note. The identity of the deceased was established by a driver's license and confirmed by his address and the testimony of neighbors. Daniel Alexander Pratt, deceased. The time of death is approximately 8:30 a.m., June 29, 2015. It seemed like a simple suicide. Suicide or murder? July 3, 2015. Gil Mumford had a flair for this case, and he and Reyes respected and relied on his intuition. Most homicide detectives rely on their instincts to solve a case. Instinct, intensive training, and many years of experience. But most importantly, they always ask themselves the question, what does my intuition tell me? Mumford kept replaying the crime scene in his head. Something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what it was yet. He was putting off talking to Mike, hoping that he could help sort out his anxiety. It looked like a suicide, but Gil was increasingly convinced that they were missing something important. He decided it was time to discuss this with Mike so that, looking from 2 points of view, they could come to a common decision. It doesn't look like suicide, Mike. Well, what do you think? There are no signs of forced entry, except for Pratt's fingerprints. No one left any traces. No one saw anyone enter or leave the house. True, but there was also no suicide note, and the house was too clean. The technician said the gun was wiped clean, and there was only one set of prints. Stop, Gil. We both know that the absence of a note doesn't mean anything. Of course, the place was strangely clean, but that's not an indicator either. What about the beating he got? Yes, we know that in 2009 he was severely beaten and he got scars, but this easily explains depression and suicide, Gil. Yes, but we also know that not everyone who is depressed is suicidal. Something's not right here, Mike. All right, Gil. You take care of beating him up, and I'll keep working on Pratt. But Gil, don't get too involved in this case. July 5, 2015. So, James Harold Scott was paroled in May 2013, after serving about 3 years of a 6-year sentence for assaulting Pratt. Okay, so he came out, and we know that he beat Pratt badly. Let's be honest, Mike. He's done some serious damage. Broken nose, damaged eardrum, punctured lung, broken ribs. Pratt had to undergo several surgeries and lost hearing in one ear. Yes, he had a lot of surgeries and months of physical rehabilitation, enough for anyone to get depressed. Just because Scott is free doesn't necessarily mean he killed Pratt. You're right, Mike, but Pratt was afraid of Scott. I have studied all the materials on the case, arrest records, court records, as well as Scott's prison and parole documents. There are a lot of oddities there. Okay, tell me everything you think. Convince me, Gil. Pratt began an affair with Scott's wife, and this caused a conflict. Scott beat him up and spent 3 years in prison. Here's his case. Take a look for yourself. He did not hide his intentions. Gil handed Mike a folder, and Mike opened it. I'm George Flute. I am the Institutional Parole Officer, or IPO, of the Texas Board of Pardons. Today is Wednesday, April 1st, 2010. The purpose of this interview is to prepare a summary of the case of the parole of prisoner James Harold Scott for the Supervisory Board, which will be held on October 1st, 2010. I'm doing this interview today in Lewis C. Pollard's block, or B2, and recording it with a digital voice recorder. Before the interview began, I got acquainted with the prisoner's dossier. Mr. Scott, for the record, please state your full name and TDCJ number. James Harold Scott, number TDCJ 325-9416. Thanks. Now, you're welcome. Mr. Scott, according to your file, in October 2009 you were convicted of aggravated assault with grievous bodily harm to Daniel Pratt and sentenced to by the age of 6. And yes, I taught this Pratt a lesson. Okay, we'll come back to that later. First, I want to clarify some procedural issues. You were sentenced to 6 years and have been in custody for about 6 months. Really? Has it really been that long? Time flies. Yes, well, oh yes. In the state of Texas, you are eligible for an annual parole review. This interview is being conducted to prepare for the first revision. If you are denied parole, preparations for subsequent annual reviews will begin 4 months before the review date hearing. Do you understand? That's fine. Great. So, according to your dossier, you are currently in G1, or in the general building, you have no work assignments and no resume on behavior. Do you agree? Yes, yes and yes. I also note that you had no previous criminal record, right? I was convicted of violating the rules of inspection in 2003, but otherwise I behaved well. Good. Today we are trying to analyze your track record, your behavior after arriving here, resume, work assignments, self-improvement, etc., as well as your reaction to the crime you committed and your state of mind at the time of its commission. In this way, I will be able to briefly describe to the Commission the elements that they will take into account when considering parole. They will look at the nature of the crime, as well as your remorse, the potential for recidivism, and how the release may affect your victim or victims and society at large. More specifically, the severity of the crime, letters of support and/or protest, the length of the sentence compared to the time served, your criminal history and any subsequent prison sentences, the history of minors and your institutional adaptation, participation in specialized programs. Do you have any questions before we start? Yes. What is the memory capacity of this recorder? Excuse me? The amount of memory. You asked if I had any questions. I'm wondering how much memory your recorder has. I'm not sure. It seems to be 10 gigabytes. Do you have any questions related to today's proceedings or the scheduled meeting of the Commission? No. Thank you. Good. Let's look at your verdict. Your file indicates that on June 29, 2009, you assaulted Mr. Daniel Pratt, causing him significant and irreversible bodily injury, and were arrested without incident 4 days later. Mr. Pratt was hospitalized and underwent 3 surgeries as a result of your attack. Could you tell me about this incident and what caused it? Of course. I was at my company's summer barbecue, drinking beer and talking to one of my colleagues, when I saw my wife's car pull up. When I excused myself and went to her car, my wife Kate got out of the passenger compartment. I saw that she was smiling at the driver, and I looked at who was getting out on the other side. I caught a glimpse of him as I walked towards them. I was very excited. As I approached the car, my wife noticed me, smiled shyly and started greeting me, but I ignored it and came closer. Dan was standing by the open car door and talking to Kate. When he saw me, he opened his mouth to say something, but he didn't have a chance. I acted quickly, and from that moment on, everything changed. His wife screamed, and he fell. I said a few words to him that were supposed to convey my dissatisfaction with the situation. I made it clear that this was a serious lesson, and if I had faced the consequences, things could have gotten even worse. He nodded as blood trickled from his ear. All right, I said. Now get up and go home. Kate ran to the car to help Dan. I asked her what she was doing and she replied, Jesus, Jim, you could have seriously hurt him. What's wrong with you? I told her that Dan was going to be fine and that he just needed to leave. Then I asked her to go back to the car. Get in the car, I told her in a firm voice. She looked a little scared, but she obeyed. I opened the door and she got into the passenger seat. Closing the door, I returned to the other side of the car. I turned around and saw my friend John standing nearby. I offered John to take Kate to her mother, and he agreed. We decided that this would be the best option for everyone. I asked him to tell her that she had better stay with her mother for a while for her own safety. John and I then went for a beer and some chicken wings. I tried a couple of interesting beers that were served there. It was a good evening. After that, I went home and went to bed. A few days later, the police came to me and arrested me. Thanks. Apparently, you don't regret what happened? No, I don't regret it. My only regret is that I made a mistake about my wife. And Dan should have been more careful. Maybe he would have avoided it. Did you talk about the warning? Yes, I warned him that the consequences could be even worse. But he didn't take it seriously. He even testified against me in court, as if he wanted me to go to jail. It's weird, isn't it? And if you had been released, would you have come into conflict with Mr. Pratt again? I think not. I did what I thought was right. This application will be considered by the commission. I understand that they can decide that. But I still think that justice should be more just. The system should protect families, not those who interfere with them. Just to be clear, if you are released, do you plan to harm anyone else? No, I don't want to conflict with anyone else. I think the situation is already quite tense. Mike, this is only the first part of his testimony. He was released early after several meetings. So he only served half of his sentence and threatened Pratt all the time? Yes, he continued to insist on his own, although according to the documents he behaved well. Is it worth keeping an eye on him? There is no reason for this yet, especially since Pratt is no longer with us. But maybe you should invite him to a conversation, although we have already set several flags for it. Flags? Yes, if there are any suspicious movements, we will find out about it. When will he be released for good? In 3 more months. After that, he will most likely leave the state. Do you think he's our man? Now more than ever. Then let's talk to him and his ex-wife. July 5th. I'm constantly afraid. What he did to Dan, and what he's capable of, scares the hell out of me. Has he ever threatened you directly, Mrs. Scott? Not directly, no. But his friend John made it clear to me that I had to be careful. I stayed with my mother until Jim was arrested, and only then returned to get my things. We've read your victim impact statement, Mrs. Scott. Please call me Kate, detective. Thank you, Kate. We would like to know a little more about the missing money and things. Can you tell us about it? He took all our money, took everything he could out of the house, and I haven't seen a cent since. Now I am in the middle of a civil trial, trying to return some of the funds, but I have little hope. Kate Scott recalled 3 years of her life, telling a story to 2 detectives. I was sitting in my car in the driveway of the house that Jim and I shared. At that time, we had been married for 14 years, and until the last few months, these were happy years. I thought I understood what was waiting for me when I entered the house, but almost immediately regretted it. It was my mistake. I was aware of that. I've come to terms with the consequences of my decisions, and I thought Jim could handle it too. He needed time, and I was ready to give him that, up to a certain point. Perhaps imprisonment will be good for us. I knew I needed Dan and had feelings for him. Jim didn't like it, but he had to accept it. I was surprised by his harsh reaction to Dan, and it upset me. Have you stopped loving your husband, Kate? She thought about it. She believed that she still loved Jim in her own way. She liked that he took care of her, that he had a stable job, and she was happy with their life together. No, detective, I felt the same way about him as I always have. The 2 detectives exchanged glances, surprised by her response. Excuse me, go on, one of them said. Kate sighed and continued. I turned off the ignition, took my phone and bag, and got out of the car. I walked down the path to the door with a feeling of anxiety. I stopped, pulled myself together, and decided to be firm. After all, Jim was in jail, and I had nothing to fear. However, I was not prepared for what I saw. Entering the foyer, I took a quick look around. There was no furniture. The table with the pull-out lid was gone. The walls were empty. The living room was also completely empty, without any furniture or decor. The heels of my shoes clattered loudly on the floor as I walked around the house, seeing the same picture in every room. Everything is gone. Even household appliances, a double oven, a stove, and lamps, were taken out. I looked out the window, and even there was nothing left. The patio furniture, the garden canopy. Everything was gone. Then I hurried into the bedroom. It was empty too. My closet, Jim's closet, everything was taken out. I went to the office where my most valuable things were kept, but there was nothing left. I started crying, realizing the magnitude of what had happened. I lost my diplomas, photos, and more. All our expensive furniture, appliances, my jewelry and clothes are gone too. I took out my phone and called the police. Constable would arrive 20 minutes later and found me sitting on the windowsill in a depressed state. Between sobs, I managed to explain to him that I had just returned home after a trip and found that the house had been robbed. He looked around the house and said he had never seen such thorough work. They even took out the switches and grills of the air conditioners, he said. "Ma'am, do you live here alone?" "What is it?" he asked, noticing the absence of an engagement ring. "No, officer, I live here with my husband," I replied. "Where is he now?" "He was arrested a few days ago." The constable nodded, taking notes, and continued to inspect the empty house. After a while, he found a white envelope in the bathroom. There was nothing there but a mirror, a towel holder, and a dispenser. On the envelope was written, "For Mrs. Scott." "It looks like it's for you, Mrs. Scott," he said. After reading the inscription, "Get out of here," I anxiously turned the envelope over. It wasn't sealed, and there was nothing on the back. I opened it and took out one piece of paper. It was not handwritten and was not signed. It contained the following: "You took it from me. My love, my trust, my self-respect, my money, my best years, and my naivety. The years of my life that I would like to get back were stolen by you. I know you won't miss me as much as you should, like most wives, so I took away what I think you're going to miss the most. Everything else. Get out of here." "So, what happened, Mrs. Scott? Did you find out anything? Did you get your stuff back?" "I can only guess, Detective Mumford. I think Jim took everything out of the house and either sold it or threw it away. Nothing could be returned." "What about the money? I also noticed in your loss statement that several $100,000 were missing. Has any of this been found?" "No, and it's even worse. Jim cashed out our savings, withdrew all the money from our checking accounts, and also cashed out his retirement accounts. He also refinanced a $375,000 home. According to my lawyer's estimates, he withdrew about $1.2 million in total. And it didn't come up? He still hasn't confessed? It's hard to imagine. Has he ever answered direct questions about what happened to the money? He claims he doesn't remember anything. He says he was so upset about my cheating and the fight with Dan that he lost track of the events for 2 weeks after that. He seems to hold a lot of grudges, Mrs. Scott. It's understandable why you decided to have a relationship with another person. But why not just divorce him and avoid all these difficulties? That's the saddest part, Detective Reyes. Before all this, Jim was a good man. I cheated on him not because he was bad, but because I thought I could and deserved it. I never expected such a turnaround. What will Jim say?" "Mr. Scott? James Scott?" He looked at the two men standing at his door in surprise. "Yes, but everyone calls me Jim. How can I help you?" "I'm Detective Mumford, and this is Detective Reyes. We'd like to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind." "Well, you've already started. What's the matter?" "Excuse me? First you asked me if I was James Scott, then you asked if we could ask questions. It's already been a few questions." Reyes smiled slightly, and Gil Mumford sighed and continued. "We are investigating the circumstances of Daniel Pratt's death and would like to talk to you about it." Jim was silent for a while and then asked, "What do you want to know? Can we come in?" "Of course, come in. Would you like something to drink?" "Thanks, no." "Could you tell us what your relationship was with Mr. Pratt?" "Of course. Let me think about the best way to say it." He thought for a moment. "There are two sides to each of us, the good side and the bad side. We usually choose a good one because it's easier to live that way. But sometimes the bad side takes over. And although most of us are generally good people, there are times when we act on the basis of our lower aspirations. I had such a moment with Dan Pratt. It was my relationship with him. But is it true, Mr. Scott, that Dan Pratt had an affair with your wife? Doesn't that describe your relationship more accurately? I would say that this describes their relationship. And my relationship with Dan is related to how I found out about it and what it did to me. What I did next better describes my relationship with him. Tell us how you found out about your wife's infidelity. I've told Kate several times that I don't trust Dan and I don't want her to spend time with him, but she didn't listen. When she started lying about where she was, I realized something was wrong. At first, she said she was just having dinner with him, but then it started happening more and more often. I realized that our marriage was coming to an end. I was already ready to file for divorce when I first ran into Dan. A week after that, I made it clear to him that I would not tolerate his interference in my life. What happened at this meeting? It was a turning point for me. I realized that it was time to act. After this event, I felt the balance in my life again. How exactly did you solve this issue? I just accepted my situation and did what I thought was right. I was happily tinkering with the grill and sipping a beer when I noticed Dan and Kate laughing together in the kitchen. I felt very annoyed. Closing the grill, I headed to the kitchen. As soon as I entered, their conversation was instantly interrupted. "Hi, Jimmy. Thanks for the invitation." Dan laughed. "I'm James to you, and to be honest, I didn't invite you. I think you should leave right now." "Jim," Kate screamed. "Don't be so rude. I invited Dan, and he is always welcome in our house. Apologize to him and behave yourself." "You see, Jimmy, it looks like I'm welcome here. Why don't you go back to the grill while I'm with Kate?" I turned to my wife and said calmly, "Kate, if this man does not leave our house in 20 seconds, I will make sure that he is not here, and you will follow him." "Jim, what nonsense. Dan is my friend, and you're being absurd." "Kate, you have 10 seconds left. Get him out of here now." Turning around, I opened the door to the backyard and attracted the attention of all the guests. "Sorry, friends, but it looks like we're going to have to cancel the evening. Kate invited someone I wasn't expecting, and now it's become more important than my desire to spend time with you. I think the evening might not end well, and I'm just not in the mood right now." I turned to Kate, who was standing looking at me in surprise. "Well, has he left? You're a terrible person," she exclaimed, throwing a glass at me. "I don't think that's fair, Kate," I said as the glass crashed against the wall behind me. The next week passed in silence. We hardly spoke. Neither of us apologized. By the end of the week, Kate had calmed down a bit, and I was still full of emotions. I was planning to end the relationship and had already been to a lawyer to prepare for the divorce. The house belonged to me before our marriage, but I wanted to make sure that everything would be fair. I knew we'd have to split up the property, but I wanted to keep the house for myself. We had no children, and our financial assets could easily be divided equally. I was already ready, but the events of that day accelerated the process. I decided not to invite Kate to the corporate barbecue. However, I later found out that Dan had decided to come himself to show everyone their relationship. He was mistaken in thinking that he could do this without consequences. As you know, it didn't end well. The next day, I closed all our accounts and canceled our credit cards to protect myself from possible expenses on her part. I wanted to be ready for anything. "So where is the money now?" Mumford asked. "Are you investigating this for a civil case?" "No, I'm just interested." "I'm sorry, but I can't say for sure. Everything is gone. You remortgaged the house and emptied the accounts for $1 million, and you just don't know where the money is?" "It's hard to say. Money comes and goes, just like people." "How did you manage to vacate the house so quickly?" Mumford continued. "I have a lot of friends. But didn't you want to discuss Dan Pratt?" Jim smiled. "That's right. Where were you on the morning of June 29, 2015? Do you want to know about the whole morning? It would be useful." "Okay. I was at home at 6 a.m., had coffee, read the newspaper, and did my chores." "You didn't leave the apartment?" "No, except to get a newspaper." "Can you confirm this?" "Rather, Detective Mumford. Can you prove otherwise?" Mumford looked displeased, and Reyes intervened to stop a possible quarrel. "Mr. Scott, have you sent letters to Dan Pratt in the last few years?" "No, not letters. Just reports." "Why?" "He was so interested in me going to jail that I thought he would be interested in following my progress." "Did you threaten him?" "No, I made a promise." "What's the difference?" "Perspective. Threats may be empty, but promises must be fulfilled. Do you see the difference?" "Mr. Scott, you killed Dan Pratt." "No, Detective. But I would really like to do it." "It's over, Gil. We can't prove anything. We were told to finish the case." "Damn it. We both know Scott has something to do with this, Mike. Maybe, perhaps Pratt's fear of Scott and his promises pushed him to take this step. Maybe Scott killed him or pushed him. We don't know, and we can't prove it. We don't have a choice, Gil. We have to close the case as a suicide. He'll be free in 3 weeks anyway, Gil. He'll be away in a month. Just leave it alone. Come on, Mike. Let's just… No, Gil. Let's face the facts. Pratt trespassed, got what he deserved. My husband beat him up, and I don't blame him. Which man would not have thought of this if he had been deceived? Pratt was guilty, but he was also scared. Scott realized this and used it to his advantage. Pratt committed suicide because he was weak. The end of the story. You're probably right, Mike, but we can't let people take the law into their own hands. You're right too, Gil, but the laws that Scott violated, he fully reimbursed the state of Texas. And the rest? Scott would have been better off moving on, but he didn't break the laws either. Prison made him more careful, and he had a lot of time to plan. Perhaps if Pratt had followed the advice and ignored the threats, he would have been alive. Who knows? All I know for sure is that no one has one here. Kate. Kate was climbing the stairs to the second-floor apartment she shared with her cat. She was tired after a difficult week. Her relationship with Dan and Jim's subsequent reaction led to her finding herself in a difficult financial situation. Lately, she had little free money and time, and she constantly looked tired. Lately, her fear has decreased. Jim had left Texas almost a year ago, and she began to feel that this chapter of her life was coming to an end. Finally, she was just going through the mail when she noticed the postcard. She was interested in it. She didn't remember anyone she knew traveling at the moment. Kate looked at the front of the postcard. She was from Majuro in the Marshall Islands. The front side depicted a beautiful beach seen at sunset or sunrise. How would she know? The words, "I wish you," were also written on the front side. She turned the card over and gasped. There was one word written in Jim's handwriting. Go away. Jim. Jim? The money and household items were never seen again. Jim left Texas shortly after his obligations to the state were fulfilled and went to the Marshall Islands. He has changed, and not for the better. Perhaps it would be better to say a broken man. The affair and betrayal of his wife were the beginning of his changes, and Dan's ridicule and Jim's harsh reaction deepened them. The prison has left its mark. This is not a place where a person can heal. He will probably come out even more damaged than when he entered. Jim Scott was no exception. A once happy, loyal, non-confrontational, hard-working citizen has turned into a man filled with hatred and revenge, capable of extreme violence and incapable of empathy or forgiveness. He never fulfilled his promise to Dan Pratt to never touch him again. He didn't have to. The repeat action was unnecessary, and Jim didn't mind. Pratt was dead. As for his ex-wife, there is still a lot to figure out.